Namaste and greetings. I, Gupta, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav एवं नीति अनुसंधान संस्थान, Nai Delhi, extend my warmest welcome to you all to IMPRI Web Policy Learning. We are gathered today for day 7 of an online international autumn school program, a 1-month immersive online certificate training course on contours of public policy in India in the Amrit Kaal. This training program is organized by IMPRI, Center for the Study of Finance and Economics, CSFE. This course will be chaired by Professor Mukul, visiting distinguished professor IMPRI, former professor, Kuan School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore, NUS. The panel of conveners comprises of Dr. Devendra Singh, Senior Visiting Fellow IMPRI, Dr. Simi Mehta, CEO and Editorial Director IMPRI, and Dr. Arjun Kumar, Director IMPRI. The experts for today's session are Mr. Harsh Gupta Madhusudhan, Professor Mukul and Ambassador Shashank. I welcome all the participants to this enlightening deliberation and thank you for being interested and putting your time, energy, and efforts into understanding emerging issues pertaining to the Indian subcontinent and helping us to bring together the practitioners and participants through this course for impactful policy research and action. We have also shared the course outline and reading resources in your email for your kind perusal. Before we start today's session, I would like to remind the housekeeping announcements once again. Please join the meeting on time. There will be a Q&A session after each presentation. Kindly share your questions in the Q&A box. The questions must not be posted as an anonymous attendee. And ensure that your questions are precise and kindly refrain from making any general comments in order to save time. Now, without any further ado, let us start the program. I would like to invite Professor Mukul to start the program and give his opening remarks. Over to you, sir.
Namaste, dhanyawad. Today, we are going to have a discussion on 3 different topics, but of course, integrated to public policies. The first is by Harsh Gupta Madhusudhan. He and Rajiv Mantri had written a book called A New Idea of India. It has been an influential book. It has got 2nd edition has come out. And what he will explain how they view India in the civilizational ethos. We had talked about the word oikophobia, and his book is a very good start to try for us to overcome the oikophobia that we had discussed. The second topic is on reforming public enterprises, but I have titled it as marketization of public enterprises. And the key message is that you can improve the workings of the public enterprises without change in ownership, because economic theory doesn't talk about ownership. It only talks about theory of the firm, how to get the firm to be efficient. And the ownership is usually not the deciding factor. So I will give you a lot of examples, particularly in this case from the banking sector and from the Indian Railways. The third is on the foreign policy, which right now is a very topical thing, but the foreign policy, like all other things, is also undergoing a transformation. And increasingly, we have been talking about change versus transformation. And in the Amrit Kaal, we want transformation. Transformation for India to become a industrial, high, relatively high middle income country with the characteristics and the mindset of a more mature and developed nation. So that mindset change is needed as well. And the foreign policy, what we have seen is that increasingly there is very little, there is less and less distinction between domestic policy and foreign policy. They go on each other. And earlier, our foreign policy officials, they were not really uh, assessed on the economic value they bring to the country. Now the ambassadors are valued at what they can bring to the country in economic terms as well. So we have got now the very complex set of geopolitics, and Ambassador Shashank will explain to us how we can, what those challenges are and how we can address them. So with that, we start with Harsh. Harsh, please.
Thank you so much, Professor Asher. Thank you to the organizers. How long should I speak before we go for the question and answer part? Because that's also 15-20 minutes, right?
So you can speak for about 20-30 minutes and then we can
20 minutes.
And then there'll be a question and answers immediately afterwards. Okay.
Before that, Tripta, would you like to introduce it?
Sure, it would be my pleasure.
Okay.
Before we begin, to introduce our first expert for today, we have Mr. Harsh Gupta Madhusudhan, author of A New Idea of India, Individual Rights in a Civilizational State. We welcome you, sir. If you could please take it from here. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tripta. Thank you, Dr. Arjun and Professor Asher. And welcome to all the attendees. I think we have around 11 of them, so I can take the names: Amruta, Arjun, Ashish, Gulab Bhai, Nikita, Ruchika, Soumya, Saurabh, Shashwati, Sonan, and Vivek. So now that I've taken your names, you're all forced to pay attention. This is the second edition of the book, as Professor Asher was mentioning, A New Idea of India, the Civilizational Republic, published by Penguin. It just came out this year. The first edition came out almost 3 years ago. And the first chapter of the book is called India That is Bharat, since that is also very topical right now. The idea overall was, if you remember, in 1997, more than 25 years ago, there was a book written called The Idea of India by Sunil Khilnani. And there a particular idea of India was presented, what we call the Nehruvian idea of India. And it had three main prongs: certain interpretations of non-alignment, secularism, and socialism, respectively in foreign policy, social policy, and economic policy. And the idea for this book that Rajiv and I wrote, it actually began more than a decade ago in a series of columns we were writing. We did not actually plan of writing a book. Those columns combined together became a book, and then we heavily edited and added new material. And we started by writing, we had a debate in the Indian Express with Ashutosh Varshini, who's a very well-known professor at Brown University. And it was on very much the first principles of political science and political philosophy. So what in the first edition, the subtitle is called Individual Rights in a Civilizational State, which is what Tripta mentioned. In the second edition, we just kept the same meaning, but because it was a mouthful, we shortened it to the Civilizational Republic. And the idea is both those aspects, the civilizational part and the republic or individual rights part, are often seen as orthogonal to each other. They are seen as somehow one represents quote unquote right, one represents quote unquote left, even though these terms don't really mean anything anymore. And if you have a civilizational view of India, you don't necessarily have a democratic or republican view of India. And if you have a republican view of India, you don't necessarily accept India as an ancient continuing civilization. And we thought that was a false dichotomy. More specifically, we wanted to focus on individual rights. The reality of India is community-based, communitarian. But the new part here is that because of economic growth, intermixing, urbanization, more and more intercaste marriages, etc., people are seeing themselves as more and more Indian. Like you could be born in Calcutta, you could live and study in Delhi, you could be working in Bangalore, and then you could marry somebody from Mumbai and so on and so forth. And that's no longer that unheard of. It's quite common actually. So the idea was a new India is coming up, but that new India very much retains its origins thousands of years ago in what we can call Bharat in the Vedas, etc. And unlike people who today disagree with that, Nehruvians, Gandhians, Ambedkarites, we specifically mention Nehru, Ambedkar, and Gandhi themselves did not think like that. They very much saw India as modern India as the next stage or the inheritance of a long-standing ancient civilization. So the core thesis of the book is, through the agency of a modern democratic state, this ancient, large subcontinental civilization is transforming into a modern nation. So it's always been a civilization. In political terms, it was not a nation state. And through the instruments of a democracy, it is becoming a modern nation state. And it is, of course, in a global context. You know, you had the Treaty of Westphalia in Europe in the 17th century. Colonialism happened. This is a post-colonial state. But the post-colonial state is building on something earlier, because when partition happened, what is now Pakistan and later Bangladesh separated, arguably Myanmar was no longer with us. Some may argue of Sri Lanka and Nepal as borderline cases. But what has kept together India is its civilization. And many people have written about this before us as well. Dinayak famously wrote A Secret Geography of India. So this is not to in any way make a chauvinist case for Indian nationalism. This is to, in a very objective sense, try to understand what is it that keeps us together. It is both the civilizational aspect and the republican aspect. Because if the civilizational aspect was not there, you could not build a democratic republic on top of that. But if the republican part was not there, there would be no peaceful transfer of power across different groups. And unlike China, which is maybe not as homogeneous as some people think, but much more homogeneous than India, it has a long tradition of statecraft. India without democracy could simply not remain united. We tried that. There were quote unquote native resistances, for example, by the Marathas in the 17th century and the early to mid 18th century. And despite great bravery by them, by Jats, by Sikhs, by Ahoms in Assam, and many other groups, because of infighting, eventually a modern state could not come through. It was only through the agency of a democracy on the top fertile soil of the civilization that what we have is what today is finally taking us to the moon, to Mars, to be able to stare down communist China, to be able to stare down a Five Eyes NATO member, as Sir very briefly alluded to, with foreign policy being topical, and I'm sure the Honorable Ambassador will speak about it in the last session. So the basic idea of the book is this India that is Bharat is the building block. Now, then we have a chapter on saving secularism from the secularists. We talk about for genuine secularism where there is separation of state and religion. We basically call it Panth Nirpekshta in Hindi or Sanskrit. The wrong word is Dharm Nirpekshta. The idea is to not be nirpeksh to dharma. The idea is to be neutral towards specific or different paths, panth. So in that sense, it's very interesting that Dr. Radhakrishnan, the first Vice President of India and the second President of India, once very famously called Hinduism to be a commonwealth of religions. He did not call it a religion. He called it a commonwealth of religions. Because it's like a dharmic umbrella with Indian idiom or Bharatiya Sanskriti, in which all paths are accepted: atheist, agnostic, theist, within theist, Vaishnavite, Shaivite, Shakta, Sikh, Baudh, Jain, Nastik, Astik, various falsafas, philosophies, and darshanas, all of them are accepted. So it's not a one-to-one comparison with, let's say, Christianity or Islam. So in that sense, the state's reality is Hindu or more broadly dharmic. Its foundation is society or nation is Hindu or dharmic. The state must be neutral or secular in the sense it must consider all individual citizens equal, must not have appeasement of any kind. And that is the building block of the modern India we are building. Of course, there are realities. For example, There is a history of caste discrimination, which we have a strong affirmative action program for. There is the discrimination on the basis of sex or gender, and there are affirmative action programs there as well. But the idea is eventually to surpass them, to not have the need for them, to, in a philosophical sense, have a sunset clause while recognizing the current reality. The fourth chapter is called Profit is Not a Dirty Word. That is the very famous line that Pandit Nehru told J.R.D. Tata, that Jay, don't talk to me about profit. Profit is a dirty word. And there's a very famous video of actually Lee Kuan Yew, since Sir was a professor at Lee Kuan Yew for a long time, in which he said, if you make profit a dirty word, everything that you see around us will collapse. And that's exactly what happened. India was actually becoming more and more poorer on a relative basis compared to the West and, of course, Japan, etc., till the late 90s. In fact, at one point in the mid 90s, we almost went to 1% per capita income of the United States on a market exchange rate basis. I mean, of course, if you adjust for cost of living, it is a bit higher, but we fell down to as low as 1%, around $300 for us, around $30,000 for the US at that point of time. That is, and right now that number is, instead of 100x, 90x, it's more like 30x. So we've kind of gone up 3 times on a relative basis. And the interesting journey for the next 25 years for Amrit Kaal is it will accelerate much faster. In fact, my next book, which I'm writing right now, is called Long India. So that is more on the economic financial side of it. And the last chapter is what we call decolonizing the Indian state, where we say, there are many things which we inherited from the British and we kind of blindly continued in terms of bureaucracy, in terms of lifelong tenure, in terms of lack of incentives, lack of reforms, for example, of the railways, etc., which we are only now finally doing deep administrative, judicial, police reforms. And even then we are in very early stages. Urban governance is another big issue. The ironic, the tragicomic thing is the people from whom we inherited these structures, they themselves have reformed their state decades ago. I mean, mostly for the good. Sometimes they've also made mistakes. Making mistakes is normal. But we, for the longest period of time, for example, I think it was only 20 odd years ago when we finally started even talking about our budget in the morning instead of evening, because we used to declare the budget in the evening because that used to be morning in London. Even small things like that, it took us decades to realize that we should not do things purely out of inertia. So that's a very quick overview of the book. I'll just give you a brief overview of the chapters again. India, that is Bharat. The second chapter was From Civilization to Nation. I compare us to the West. I interrogate what the West is as a civilization. If there is a secessionist movement in Quebec or Catalan in Spain or Northern Ireland, etc., they are ultimately moving pieces within the greater liberal West. Whereas, of course, I talk about Karl Popper, we talk about Karl Popper and Kashmir. If you do that in the Indian context, that is crossing civilizational boundaries. So a Quebec secessionist movement is more like creating Telangana out of the Indian Union in terms of a better analogy. Saving secularism from secularists, profit is not a dirty word, decolonizing the Indian state. So those were the very broad ideas. I urge you all to read the book. I mean, how much time do I have left, Tripta, before the questions?
So you can take a few minutes to.
Okay, so I think one thing I would really like to focus on, given that the context is a more slightly economics in the next 25 years, I think it's very important to understand the Indian civilization is a unique civilization whereby it, and sometimes we make a virtue out of it, we did not have state capacity, especially over the last 1,000 years. So we write it in the book, a civilization without a state is like a body without a backbone. And that's something, for example, the Jews discovered thanks to great loss and great horror during the Holocaust. And now, of course, they have Israel, the state of Israel. The reason that is important is, there is some academics in the US have come up with a very interesting topic called the narrow corridor. The narrow corridor, the idea is that there must be a good state-society balance for any good economy and society to develop, because then the state keeps the society accountable, society keeps the state accountable. If you have too strong a society, it's totalitarianism. If you have a very strong society, there is no coherence. You can't take collective actions, can't build infrastructure, can't go to war, have economies of scale, and so on and so forth. So in India, what happened was, although it started DNA evidence shows that endogamy of caste started around 1500 years ago during the late Gupta Empire. But these things accelerated during Turkish invasions and later European invasions. And the Indians village republic, which we sometimes Gandhiji praised, Ambedkar did not praise, became very self-sufficient. And the idea was that people will have their kind of hereditary professions. It was not always followed. And that led to what Ambedkar famously called the division of laborers, not the division of labor. And that obviously meant lower productivity, lower specialization, lower economies of scale. Now, I want you to visualize how finally with the state, and of course with public digital infrastructure being the latest example of cutting edge state capacity for a change, India is leading the revolution. In the last 15, 20 years, and this is across political parties, so I don't want to make it a partisan thing. We can all agree somebody did more, somebody did less, but across political parties, in the last 20 years, imagine the average Indian village went from being an isolated, almost self-contained socio-economic unit to suddenly being connected to the whole world. So you build pakka roads, small, thin pakka roads. Then through them, the transformers and generators and the electric wires came. Then you had the water pumps, drinking water, toilets, sanitation, schools came. People could drive to bigger schools slightly further away. Some clinics opened. People, instead of sewing their clothes, they would actually buy clothes from each other. Classic Adam-Smithian exchange. Neelkant Mishra, earlier of Credit Suisse, now with Access, actually had a very good paper on this 10 years ago, how Indian villages were transforming. And now with the internet, and it's with the pandemic, the great tragedy of the pandemic accelerating it, if you have the skills, you could theoretically at least do hybrid work half of the time living in an Indian village, maybe near to your loved ones with a very low cost of living. And you're completely clued in. For example, we are doing this mini lecture series thanks to Professor Asher, sitting in different parts of the world, right? So this I think is what has become normalized. I remember when I was working in London and Houston as a consultant, we used to use Skype for personal reasons, but it used to be looked down upon to use video conferencing for professional reasons, because then clients would say you're too important or too busy to not call me or come and meet me. But now that has been normalized. And what that means is the next great unbundling of services is happening. And globalization in the next 20, 30 years will be led by services and not by goods. This is where India has a great competitive advantage. This does not mean that what Dr. Raghunam Rajan says is right, that we should focus on services and not manufacturing. No, we have to focus on manufacturing. In fact, the fourth chapter of our book on economics actually takes a detour from classical liberal views. And actually, in some ways, we preempted what actually happened in the last 3 years by supporting a slightly what is now called mercantilist industrialist policy, while of course having mostly competitive free markets domestically. And if you look back, all large nations have become rich through some kind of industrial policy. It again comes back to state, from Alexander Hamilton and Frederick Lish in the US, to the Zollverein in Germany, to Japan, South Korea. Only during massive peacetime, very small city-states like Singapore and Hong Kong, but even there is massive state intervention. I mean, Singapore more than Hong Kong, till Hong Kong was finally reacquired by China in 1997. So it's very important, I'm just to kind of close down on the loop. The civilization gives us scale. What we were missing on top of that was an accountable, representative, non-totalitarian state, which after 1947, 1950, 1952, we finally got. In 1977, we made sure that no matter what happens, we will not have an emergency again in India. In some ways, I consider 1977 to be an under-celebrated moment in Indian modern history. We often focus on 47 and 1991 as economic reforms. But for me, 1977 made sure that the larger structure of Indian society and state was on a good autopilot by making sure there was no dictatorship emergency and you could change power through different political parties without killing each other. So imagine in communist China, Xi Jinping has done away with the collective leadership model. There they had Deng Xiaoping, Hu Jintao, etc. for 10 years each. And now suddenly all bets are off. So if you're a long-term investor, you have no way of understanding what happens to this political economy model after Xi Jinping. It's back to an individual dictator, not a collective dictatorship. I mean, not that a collective dictatorship is something to praise, but at least there was some predictability there. So in many ways, this ancient India, very young modern nation state, is very, very well positioned. And the very, very final point I'll say is that India represents the universalism of pluralism. It is the only civilization that is universalistic without being homogenizing. It's not proselytizing in the way some civilizations have been, or their post-religious versions have been. So in many ways, it constitutes the future. But I think if we talk too much about that, we'll be crossing our time limit for now. So back to you, Tripta and sir, and then we can take some questions.
Thank you so much, sir, for such an informative session. Before we move on to the Q&A session, I would invite Mukul sir to provide his views.
I think, let's have the participants ask questions. Yesterday, we ran short of time for the participants. So let's give more time to them instead of my commenting.
Sure, sir. We can have Nikita ji.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, loudly clear. You can go ahead.
Hi, Harsh sir. Thank you so much for the really, really good and informative session. Have been a big follower of your book's content as well as your Long India newsletter. So the one that you sent out on 10th of September after the successful G20 hosting that we had, I'm reading out from that a particular section. Moreover, democracy is the reason we do have scale in the first place. The Indian democratic civilizational republic based on dharma has arguably united India in a way no inflexible or unaccountable emperor could have. Now, you just spoke about you use the word political economy. You have also spoken about how it has helped India and how it is, say, worked out in, say, China. I really want to understand what your thoughts are on the economic implications of this strength that we have as a civilizational state, and how do you think it would play out in the Long India game that we have been discussing?
That's an excellent question, Nikita. Thank you so much for reading that blog post also in great detail. So as you rightly mentioned, it goes along with what I just mentioned in the talk. See, you need to understand according to me, one of the underestimated aspect of modern economics is the lack of studying economic history. According to me, modern economics has become too mathematical because there is a physics envy in it. I mean, I'm an IIT dropout, so I don't feel the need to show my kind of quant chops, so to speak. But I feel a lot of economists had that sense. So there's a lot of applied economics, which is all useful, I'm not saying. But in terms of public policy or real life applications, ultimately, it's not science in a Popperian sense. It's not falsifiable, right? I mean, you can do as many RCTs as you want. There is real life and you can't turn the clock back. You can only do case studies of historical analysis. So in that context, what is very important to understand is why is scale important, especially in a world in which the consensus on unilateral free trade, liberal trade, not that it ever existed fully, has broken down. It is very important because if today Bangladesh says, and Bangladesh is still quite a large economy of 150 million people, right? If Bangladesh says that, I'm going to increase tariffs on solar cells and phones and batteries by 20%, and I'm not going against, this is not the old Nehruvian license, Raj, or if Samsung comes, they'll be treated equally compared to any Bangladeshi company. But you must come and make here if you want to not pay that 20%. A lot of companies globally would say, okay, we'll think about it, but we are not so sure. I mean, even though it's a 150 million strong country with strong growth, because size matters. In India, when Narendra Modi started doing that in 2017, and there was a lot of Rona Dhona, pardon my colloquial Hindi in the middle, that, oh my God, we are going back to the Nehruvian license, Raj. No, that was a very different economic model. In fact, one of the original sins of Indian economics in 1950s and 60s was the overvalued rupee in real terms. But that's too technical. I don't want to go into it. We had a fixed exchange rate, inflation was high, and the rupee became too overvalued. And we had a devaluation in 1966, but it was not enough. And that led to all kinds of complications and corruption, and then import constraints, which led backward to license Raj. Right now, it's very different. Right now, it's floating rates, foreign investment, FDI, FII, everything is welcome. Just make in India. And for that reason, the scale leads to a self-fulfilling prophecy. There's a biography of Warren Buffett called The Snowball Effect. It creates a snowball, because what happens is, similarly on the startup side or services side, India, as I mentioned in the blog post, India's per capita income is $2,500 per capita on market exchange basis. Many emerging economies are close to $10,000, but they're much smaller in size, which is why their best and brightest, often going to the US, UK, Canada for studying, do not come back, because even though they're richer on a per capita term, they're so much smaller in aggregate sense. There is no local or foreign investment based PE VC ecosystem for them to say, take this $10-20 million, do a specific niche vertical e-commerce or this and that, do something in renewable energy, because it is not such an obvious bet. But in India, which is why I always say it's important to be cautious, it's also pessimistic, but also optimistic, because both have self-fulfilling aspects. In India, 84% of IIT Bombay graduates, and IIT Bombay attracted the highest ranks in IITs, even though I went to IIT Delhi. IIT Delhi was number 2. IIT Bombay, 84% from 2000 to 2017, graduates stayed back in India or came back to India. And the reason is, it suddenly makes sense beyond emotional, family, and patriotic reasons for the best and brightest, or large segments thereof, to think of doing something in India because of the massive runway ahead, and because they can see that, the investors can see that, the government can see that, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that becomes fast, high single-digit growths, for example. So scale is important, and that scale is only because of our democracy, because nobody asks Xi Jinping, are you a southerner or westerner, or easterner or northerner? You're a Han. Nobody asked him his caste. In India, if we had a dictatorship model, we would be fighting each other all the time. But in democracy, legitimacy is there. That is what gives us scale. That is what gives us stability and predictability, unlike China. Because as I said, after Xi Jinping, we don't know what happens there. That is extremely crucial to investment. And that is what leads to this virtuous cycle. So I hope that answers the question.
Yes, understood. Thank you so much.
Next, we can have Soumya ji ask their question.
Hello, sir. It was a great answer. So I really learned from that. And my question is, what do you mean by learning from a civilization or make a policy to, analyze the civilization and make a policy? Because we had a civilization that was more on a caste basis, like Marathas and all. And now it's not like that, but still there are policies, etc., based on caste system. To add on that question, how do you think after 25 years the policy will be made? Because as we develop the caste system,
what will be made after 25
decreases.
years? What will be made after 25 years?
So after 25 years, what do you think the policy will be made based on caste or civilization? Because the casteism decreases as we
So
develop.
I think I got your point. Let me answer it. Of course,
Yeah.
it's a very complex topic. I'll try to be quick. First of all, our civilization is not based on caste. It's very important to understand. Our civilization, if you read the original Rig Veda, the Samhita, not just the commentaries, there is no mention of exclusive hereditary castes. There is only one actually verse in which the Varnas are mentioned, but the Varnas are not mentioned on the basis of birth. In all of the Shruti literature, some people talk about Chandogya Upanishad. There is one particular verse. I have a disagreeing interpretation of even that verse. It is in the Smritis, or what became the Dharma Sutras or Shastras, that came later, and they themselves talk about them not being Sanatana, them being Yuga Dharma. That is, they're only relevant for some people for some of the time. So I understand your question. It is very well intentioned, but it is important to understand our civilization was not based on caste at its core, at its metaphysical core. It is true, the lived reality, especially in the last 1,000 years or 1,300 years, became more and more ossified towards what you are saying. In fact, in the last 200 years, there has been massive movements, which we now tend to forget sometimes. And I often put on social media, I don't know if you follow me, sometimes I get a lot of hatred for that as well. Starting from Raja Ram Mohan Roy up to, in many ways, I would argue the current Hindutva movement is very deeply anti-caste. there is a clear understanding that, for example, Swami Dayanand Saraswati said, yes, we'll have Varnashram. It will not be based on birth. Arya Samaj still has that movement, and so on and so forth. The Narendra Modi, Prime Minister, Honorable Prime Minister, recently got the Adhinams from Tamil Nadu to inaugurate the new parliament, and they are not Brahmins by Jati. Although, of course, their functions are that of Brahman by Varna, right? So it's not true. Now, what will happen? We have caste reservations or quotas or affirmative action, even though there are many problems in terms of implementation. And one can argue about that in good faith. But because they're basically a reparation of a civilizational state. We acknowledge there were problems. We acknowledge we also did not do well on the economy the first few years of independence, which is why those temporary caste quotas became larger and larger and longer. Because if you don't create opportunity, if you don't expand education, first primary and then higher, then on a small basis, you're fighting each other. Then people will say, well, you are saying you're caste neutral, but it seems most of the people who are at the top are 99% of this or that kind. So it was necessary to do that. However, I believe, as I mentioned earlier in answer, it should conceptually be that with a sunset clause. As we see more and more intercaste marriages, as we see more and more, for example, the current chief of the Indian Army, COS, Chief of Armed Staff, is somebody who is a Brahmin by birth, but obviously by Varna in this particular language, he's a Kshatriya. Similarly, anybody who is doing business is a Vaishya or a Baniya, whether or not he's born that way. So the caste system has very much broken down in that sense. And I think hopefully by end of Amrit Kaal by 2047, one good example to keep in mind is the Burakumin community in Japan. They were very analogous to what we would today call the Dalit community of India. They used to work with tanned leather, etc. They were often considered untouchable, unfortunately. And there was almost no intercaste marriage between other Japanese and them about 100 years ago. But if you now go, it is around 80 to 90% intercaste marriages. The identity is basically dissolved. In fact, there are some Dalit activists from the Indian diaspora in America who are now going to Japan to try to revive that identity. So I believe with industrialization, economic growth, with our democracy, this thing will gradually wear off. We have to be patient. We have to be empathetic. We have to be respectful. But conceptually, it cannot be permanent. It has to be with a sunset clause. That sunset clause could be 25 years. That is perfectly fine.
Thank you, sir. Next, we can have Amrita ji have asked their question. Can you make it brief? Yeah.
Good evening, sir. My question was, do you foresee or fear homogenization owing to the emulation of the West?
Sorry, I did not get the second part of your question. I fear a homogenization owing to the
Emulation of the West.
See, I highly doubt that, because I'll give you a small example. People often talk about lack of homogeneity in India in terms of community, etc. In my own family, one uncle is a Hanuman Bhakt. My Dadi is a Krishna Bhakt. Dadaji was a big Krishna Bhakt. In fact, he and his father spent his last few days in Vrindavan. Somebody's a big Shiv Bhakt. I was Nastik till my early 20s. Somebody else is somebody else. So in a very ideational sense, there is no scope within Hindu Dharma, within this civilization, for it to become homogenized. So I don't want to be flippant in my answer to what you have very rightly brought up. There are anxieties about homogenization. We are very far from that in terms of linguistic diversity, religious or panth diversity, even community, or what we loosely call caste diversity. But even if we do intermix, say 50 years from now, our beliefs will be enormously diverse. Who we worship to or not worship to, because if it is not diverse, it cannot be Hindu Dharma. And that is what Radhakrishnan said. It is not a religion, it is a commonwealth of religions. So it is not only not going to be homogeneous, it is going to teach, if I may say slightly less humbly, teach pluralism to the rest of the world. And I think, sometimes this Vishwaguru thing sounds a bit far-fetched. I think first we should become a Vishwashishya, truly and genuinely understand the world, study the world. But when we do become Vishwashishya, Vishwaguru, a key part of that will be teaching pluralism.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for answering all the questions, and we wish you all the best for your next
Thank
book.
you. Thank you, Tripta. Thank you, Dr. Asher, and
Thank you.
very good day to you, Ambassador Shashank sir. Also, I'll take my leave. Thank you.
All the
Thank you.
best.
Next, I would like to invite Professor Mukul Asher, visiting distinguished professor IMPRI, former professor Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore, NUS, to discuss marketization of public enterprises. Over to you, sir.
Namaskar. May I make a request?
Sir, of course.
Ambassador Shashank is here. May I request that the next speaker could be Ambassador Shashank, and I'll speak last
We can do that.
because he's already here.
Is that
Sure,
fine,
sir.
Mr.
Yeah.
Shashank?
For me, it's okay so long as you are willing to listen to me.
So you can introduce, sir, quickly. Yes.
All right. Okay.
So next, I would like to invite Ambassador Shashank, former Foreign Secretary, Ministry of External Affairs, MEA, India's former ambassador to Denmark, South Korea, and Libya, for a session on key challenges facing India's foreign policy. We welcome you, sir. Over to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed. Can you hear me well?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Loud and clear.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Professor Asher,
Yes.
Professor Arjun Kumar, all the other faculty members and participants in this program. I'm really delighted and also very happy to be with you once again in this program. I think you are covering a whole range of issues which should be of great interest to our people. And in a way, I feel that what Prime Minister Modi did at G20 by taking this international conference to all parts of India, to 60 cities for more than 200 meetings, you are doing something similar, making education and holistic education available to people in India and elsewhere from the people who have educated themselves or who are like me, who are the practitioners of the foreign policy field. And I find Prakash Singh ji was with you talking about police and judicial reforms in the beginning, and I have great respect for him. Everybody has great respect for him also. I think what I would say that this is Amrit Kaal, and we have a certain responsibility to set up practical points for action. Because in foreign policy, of course, there's a little different from the domestic policies, which are accountable judicially, legally. So therefore, you have to go in the domestic policies, you have to look into the past and see whether there are any acts, whether there are any precedences, which can then be quoted in front of the law courts or in front of the various legal organizations, police authorities, etc. In our case, in the foreign policy, the past is acting as an indicator. You have to, as our foreign minister said recently about the forget and forgive issue, that forget you should never, forgive depends what you want to do. So I think forgetting we don't do, but we have to keep in mind that whatever decisions we take will have an impact on the future generations of the country. And therefore, what we are now trying to do for the Amrit Kaal and what our Prime Minister and the government are doing is really something preparing the ground for the future. And what we are doing here, sitting here in these programs, is we are preparing for the action points so that detailed points can be prepared on which action can be taken. It is quite right that there was a time when we felt that political independence had come, but economic independence or the social justice, etc., needed much more action. And therefore, what we had done at that time at the international level, the non-aligned movement, and then also the groups of 77, which started from the UNCTAD preparatory processes. So that was kept in a way so that we could work together with similarly placed countries and come up with ideas which will be available to most of these countries and would be applicable to them. Gradually, we found that this was not happening at the international level. While the people who have anticipation, who are expecting a lot of things to happen for them in the future, on the other hand, there are many other countries which feel that they stand to lose out if very poor countries or those countries which supply only the raw materials are allowed to process them, either semi-processing or full processing. It will affect the livelihood and the welfare of the people living in the countries who have been benefiting by getting these raw materials at very cheap prices, and also with the manipulation, etc., of the financial instruments in these countries and the international financial mechanisms. So therefore, what we found that over a period of time, there were individual countries, small countries particularly, their requirements were met by way of, let's say they were one commodity interest countries. So that commodity and that particular country would be given certain special benefits. So we found that many of the international meetings where we thought that we are working pro bono for most of the developing countries, most of the newly independent countries as a whole, we found that many countries did not want to listen to us. They felt, no, we are better off with the others because our interests have been taken care of. You guys are too big, and maybe you will become new colonial countries also because you have similar idea of exploiting your own people, and maybe you will exploit us also. So therefore, we found that ultimately in many of these international gatherings, only 4 or 5 countries would be left alone. And then we would find it very difficult to come up with solutions at the international level. So we found that when the Cold War was ending, we found that the new process was of what in India was called strategic autonomy. But really, I would say that that was at the international level, we started building in the early part of this millennium, the issue-based partnerships, which started as partnerships, but then gradually in some areas, they became the meeting grounds for various people. So for example, on the developing countries which were democratically inclined, we set up an organization called IPSA. It's an interregional organization, India, Brazil, South Africa. And it was really the initiative of Brazil, but they preferred to give the first name to India. So that was all right. And gradually that has now turned into, because at that time, I remember many other countries wanted to join IPSA, including China, including Russia, including Mexico, Egypt. So many other countries wanted to join that organization. But we were still not very clear that whom to deny, whom not to deny. And secondly, here the 3 countries were all very much looking into democratic societies and working from that basic position. It's a different matter that later on we found that there was some economic expert from Goldman Sachs, who later on became the Treasury Secretary of UK, who gave this idea that, okay, why not BRIC? Because they are the large economies, fast developing countries, and their economic growth will determine where the funds move, how the funds move, etc. So that was from the banking side that they had decided. But I think what people with these countries like China and Russia were thinking at that time were how to take advantage that without being of the member of non-aligned, without being members of the group of 77, how to take advantage by joining a bigger group. So they joined this BRIC, they turned it into BRICS. And so IPSA got subsumed under BRICS. And that is now, so this is a challenge which has now come into Amrit Kaal for India, that on one hand, there are these organizations which has come up like BRICS Plus. So that means that these 3 developing democratic countries, which are joined by China and Russia, and now they have decided to add 6 more countries. So this is a big challenge as to what do we gain from this one. Many experts are saying that this is a useless organization, but India must withdraw from this. immediately, because India is much better off attaching itself as G7 plus, or what we have done now, G20. In fact, G20 became a great success recently. One, of course, was that the Prime Minister Modi took it to people of India all over the country. Secondly, he brought the global south initially, and the developing countries very enthusiastically joined, and they say, okay, at G20, normally only a few countries were being invited, but now you want to have the views of all the global south, so why not? So in a way, I think this is the second thing which has happened, that G20 has become a little different from G7 plus. It has become, in some ways, BRICS plus. In some way, other ways, it has become the global south's aspirations being represented in G20. Then African Union also was being talked about. Chinese and Indians went into African Union at a time when many of these countries were under heavy debts. And as heavily indebted countries, they had to abide by a lot of regulations in the last few years of the previous century, where they were told that there must be transparency, there must be good governance, there must be proper maintenance of accounts in their countries. And suddenly they found that China had deep pockets, they were putting money. India, which had already got earlier support for the anti-racism movements and anti-colonial movements in Africa, they felt that they would be left out. So they also came in very strongly and set up partnerships with small groups, West Africa, South Africa, Southern Africa, East Africa, and all over. So we tried to do all that, and the Chinese were there. So initially, the experts in the West felt that now the new colonial countries, new exploiters have come into the market. But then gradually they found that while China was really trying to get the resources, natural resources of these African countries or other countries, wherever they were setting up their BRI initiative, the Indians concentrated on abiding by the priorities and principles laid down by the local governments in African countries or wherever we were setting our partnership, whether Southeast Asia on one side, whether with Latin America, with the new Eastern European, Central European countries, elsewhere, Central Asian countries. Everywhere we said, no, let us go on the basis of the priorities being laid by, because this is what we used to do in the past. When we were told by the international financial institutions or by the donor countries that please democratize your society, please follow these financial things. So we used to tell them that our constitution itself talks of democracy. We have to abide by our constitution. We have to abide by the priorities set by the Indian Parliament and or the cabinet. So therefore, for you to come as a parallel organization to tell us what to do, overriding our constitutional obligations, would make it very difficult for us to do. So the same principle we applied in the countries wherever we partnered. Now, this is the process which has been going on. Now, the real challenges which are now coming up in Amrit Kaal, I must come down to that first. That is, we find that in G20, they have come up with two parallel initiatives. One is the Biofuel Alliance, and the other one is the India, Middle East, Europe corridor. India had set up some other corridors in the meantime. We were trying to set up a trilateral highway with Myanmar and Thailand, and then take it up to other countries of Southeast Asia. We were also trying to do something called the International North-South Transport Corridor to go to Afghanistan at one time, and then to Central Asia, to Eastern Europe, Central Europe, and now to Russia also, because Russia also needs that very much, and they are willing to put their money in. Iran is willing to put their money into this corridor. And now we find that Saudi Arabia, Israel, and America and European countries are willing to put their money in this new corridor. So therefore, we have the challenge. And I think your organization and other academic institutions must prepare the groundwork that what should be the requirements for hardware and for software. Because it is, firstly, hardware means that you set up the multimodal transport networks. So that itself means two points. One is setting up the infrastructure. Secondly, making sure that all the connecting points are well served, they are stable, they are financially doing well, and people there are fully with these corridors, and they are not thinking that how they would be exploited whenever these new corridors come into it. Because I remember that on the question of trilateral highway, which goes to Myanmar and Bangkok and Thailand, we find that Manipur, we have a special problem where people in Northeast and especially in Manipur feel that when India became independent, many of these people became dependent. And the central government then controlled them. And about 85 to 90% of the funds which are being given to them, they were somehow leaked either to the local organizations or they came back to the various setups and intermediaries at the national level or at various other levels connecting with these countries. If you remember that our Prime Minister, former Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi had famously said that 85% of the money which is sent out by the central government does not reach the last man for which it is needed. It's a different matter that our present Prime Minister has done a tremendous lot with this direct benefit transfer, with the Aadhaar card, with the fintech technology, etc., which you must have been discussing, and I'm quite sure Professor Ashar would be talking about the state finances, how they have become all right now, or there are challenges also in some ways. So I think that is one thing we have to see. Software means that what are the customs formalities, what are the exchanges of information, what are the forms which are required to be filled in, whether they have to be done on computers, the customs data, the other kind of, so all the agreements have to be made with regard to tariffs, the non-tariff barriers, with all kinds of things. So I think this is not such a thing that you just take a declaration and feel very happy about it, but there are a lot of things practically which have to be done. So I hope that you people will be able to do it and involve other non-governmental and other semi-governmental organizations in this process. Similarly, when you say African Union will be able to, as one of the elements for the Global South wishes to be represented in G20, of course, the others would be coming in through various other means, also Southeast Asia or Latin America and elsewhere, when they are coming as BRICS Plus, and some of them would be in G20. So what are we going to do with African Union? We have recently heard that with African Union and I2U2 partners, we have decided to set up IIT campuses, one in Tanzania and another one in Abu Dhabi. So I think we should now think in terms, and we also have this e-connectivity, the telemedicine, tele-education, all kinds of other things are there. But now we must set up our institutions in many of these countries, wherever we find that they are ready to accept us. And in addition to just the faculty being international, Indian faculty, other faculty which is willing to go from other countries, but we must also have our students working there. Because I remember that when I was in Europe on my diplomatic assignments, many presidents of various universities told me, they said, look, we know that the Indian and Israeli children, they may be talking in their own peculiar English, or they may be dressed in their own peculiar ways, but they are very, very bright. And they have new ideas, and we would like very much that you please send your students to our universities. So I think I found that almost unequivocal welcome for the Indian students to go to many of the European countries. Now we should do that right from the beginning, when firstly we should set up these partnerships for MSMEs, medium and small industries. And I believe that there is some kind of a setup which African Union has accepted with India to set up an India-Africa Economic Foundation in Mumbai. And that process is going on. So we must have that MSME connectivity. And secondly, we must have, as much as possible, these educational institutions, technical institutions set up, and our people, students should be able to go. Now, final issue I would like to raise before we go for any questions. Final issue, I will say that now the India-Canada thing which is going on, that when you rise, you have to rise gradually so that others are able to accept you. as a willing partner, they get used to your rise. China rose very fast. And what the Western countries had thought that China would become like Taiwan or China would become like the West, gradually they found that China had learned much more from Gorbachev. And they were very, very reluctant to allow opening up of their government system and opening up of the economy simultaneously. In fact, they became even more controlled. And when the COVID came, they became so controlled that they have not been able to open it so far. And so because of the internal difficulties of opening the economy in China, and secondly, because the West feels that China has risen so fast that it now wants to overtake the West. It wants to become #1 country in the world, both scientifically, technically, as well as militarily. And that is not acceptable to them. So somehow India has got this position where India is being welcomed. But I found that recently in Canada, they did not like it very much, that India was rising so fast, that their traditional idea that they could have the Five Eyes alliance, whereby they could have some kind of a activity in part of Punjab, which will affect both India and Pakistan, and they could keep both of them a little bit uncertain, little bit susceptible to pressures from the Five Eyes countries and from the Western countries. So they felt that G20 is very successful. But India may follow the same way where China has gone. So therefore, I would suggest that we should now prepare our ground very carefully, #1. Secondly, we should see that our young people, young generation, because we have the largest young manpower, that they get technically qualified. They are fully aware of the neighboring countries, and they within the country itself, all the points, whether they are the connecting points or whether they choke points on the seas, they are very well taken care of. And I think as far as this Khalistan thing is going on, in case there are queries, I can take up that issue, because many news channels are asking me also. And I hope that ultimately where we have reached in G20 and BRICS Plus and various other, our connections with Southeast Asia and SCO or various other international transport connectivity ideas, we should continue to work on all of them and we don't lose out, because our model, I can see that our model is far, far better than the earlier model, which was set up by the West through Marshall Plan, and where they wanted to control through the international financial institutions like IMF, World Bank, WTO, or whatever it is, the future course of action by the developing countries, or Chinese model where they set up a BRI initiative and they gave huge amounts of money. There's no doubt about it. That is something very good. And they're setting up a lot of infrastructure, but that is led by China. What India is trying to do, and India has tried to do, that it should be something where everybody is an equal participant, but at the same time, we take lead along by having a few countries like, let's say, BRICS on one side, with Japan on one side. We were trying to set up the Japan, India, Africa corridor. Now we are trying to set up with the Middle Eastern countries, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and UAE, and Europe. So I think these kind of things we must keep in mind, that they don't fall flat in due course, but we really work hard on this, knowing that if you rise too fast, you fall also quite fast. So therefore, we must take precautions and go well with the future, and see that our future is not stymied by any kind of a, as they say, middle income trap, or this kind of a trap which is laid by our neighbors or by the distant countries who stand to lose out in some ways. I would prefer that all of us gain, but still some countries may feel that, well, they will gain less than what India would gain. So it has to be acceptable to them also. Thank you very much indeed. I hope I have been able to take some of the points and give you some challenges for us in the Amrit Kaal. And I can take, if you have 10 minutes or something, whatever you, Professor, you tell me, I will take that much time to answer questions.
Yes, thank you. I think we should give the participants a chance to interact with you.
Yes, please.
and learn from you.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much for that insightful session. First, we can have Suvendra ask their question. You can go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Archita and Professor Asher, and greetings, Arnab sir. It was absolutely enlightening to hear you and your insights. My question on this Khalistan's or ongoing Khalistan case is, Canada happens to be the ally of US, and US happens to be currently strategically inching towards India. Given the serious accusation that's being made, what should be our best and ideal diplomatic response, both to US as well as to Canada?
Well, I think our diplomatic response is already being decided by the Indian government, and that is going well. What we know is that definitely since the 70s and 80s, the main instigators for Khalistan were based in the Western countries, particularly in the countries partners of Five Eye Alliance. And because, even before we became independent, there was an idea which was mooted with the British authorities, British colonial authorities, that in addition to the Muslims getting their Pakistan and the others getting India, perhaps the Sikhs should also get a Sikh homeland. Ultimately, it was found that it will be too messy and it was left out. But then there were many people who still were devoted to it, and they felt, no, they must work on a formula, something like Israel, whereby the Jews who were deprived of their rights in Europe, they would move to Middle East, where they were more welcome at that time initially. And they would be having Jewish communities, diaspora living in the West, and they would have some kind of a greater interaction with the Israelis. So same way, if they could develop something like Khalistan in India, Punjab, and then gradually extend it to Pakistani Punjab, and then make sure that India and Pakistan are continuously made to play this game like the Middle Eastern countries are made to do. Only thing is that when USSR broke up, Chinese grew, and Chinese were given all kinds of support by the West. Technologies which were not being given to any old friends of the West were being given to China. All the other friends of the West, they were transferring all their... So what took place? The deindustrialization, hollowing out of all the industries from the West and from the friends of the West into China. India has therefore come up very fast based on that, because we have trouble with China, we have trouble with Pakistan. So now these countries are supporting India, and we are also moving fast. So this is how things are going on. I think somebody is trying to reach me here. Okay. So therefore, I think what we have to keep in mind is that there are still many organizations in the West, in these Five Eye countries. There are many NGOs, many think tanks, many deep state organizations, whether intelligence, whether in their various government departments, who have not completely changed their mind that yes, they would try to do something with India, what they tried to do with China in the past, and India perhaps would be a better bet for them. No, they still feel that India would be better off being kept at this level of Pakistan, or being turned into already where Russia and China are being made pariah states. So why not make India also a pariah state? So I think that is the challenge, and I'm quite sure that our government knows all this, because they are all experienced people, and I'm sure that they will come up with the right solution, right diplomatic solutions, and at the same time they will be taking action within our country against people who try to destabilize some parts of India. I'm worried about the Indian students, because we have about 40% of the total number of students in Canada are from India. And that's why you saw that I did mention specifically that we need to set up educational institutions in our new partner countries and see that our students, faculty also go there, and perhaps they will find them much better places. And gradually we would be able to move away from this pressure that we must send all of our students to the English-speaking countries where they can get English language education and jobs afterwards.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. We can have Ashish to ask this question next.
Yeah, are you able to hear me?
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
please.
Yeah, good evening, Ambassador Shashank. Many thanks for your presentation. I was just like you to reflect upon, the alternating trends between multilateralism and regionalism as far as, collective action problems are concerned. Do you feel that India is able to, one, provide a negotiating position, two, is in a position to set the agenda or mobilize other countries on the global level in a better way?
Well, this is a very difficult era because multilateralism is good to talk about. Easiest is that if you can work through your neighboring countries, but neighbors are often the competitors, not always cooperating with all the areas. So therefore, you have to have partnerships based on common interests. So for example, with South Africa and Brazil, we set up our partnership based on our adherence to democratic values. And secondly, we were all mega biodiversity countries. And we all wanted that our people should have enough to eat. We should be able to analyze our resources, use them for our own economic development. So I think that is how it had come up. Multilateralism, suppose when you're negotiating in regional levels, it becomes a little easier. But if you have big giants, let's say China is part of some of the regional setups. So we are afraid that unless the rules of origin have been very well defined, it is likely that we will become an easy market for the Chinese goods, which will be cheaper because they will have the economy of scale and they would be able to capture a large market in India, which is right now available to our own manufacturers. So therefore, our manufacturers would have no interest in sharing their market with the Chinese. So therefore, we have to find out how best to do that. Secondly, in case we have regional or inter-regional cooperation with, let's say, very advanced countries. Now, advanced countries have moved into an area where they have a lot of environmental standard because they've spoiled the environment and the climate so much in the past that in future now their people don't want that. So they have to take very environment-friendly policies in their own countries, and they're insisting that their partners in the regional, inter-regional alliances, trade or finance or anything, they must also implement all these things, and they will examine whether these environmental, labor standards, education standards, working standards, whether they are being met by these partner countries or not. So there are these challenges which come. Multilateral institutions, yes, I mean, if you are thinking of, let's say, the United Nations. So right from the beginning, United Nations was a hobbled organization. And we knew that. And in the First World War and Second World War, India lost the largest number of manpower. And we were once responsible for the victory of the what they call the democratic countries of the West, because we lost many people, and they're mostly very young people. So I think rather than having India as one of the permanent members of the Security Council, and they said, okay, you are a good democracy, but come in afterwards. We'll see 10 years, 20 years, 40 years, 100 years afterwards, we'll get you. In the meantime, they wanted only Taiwan there in the beginning, or they wanted India, a very weak India, which will be totally dependent on the other permanent members of the Security Council. So somehow that was the decision taken by the government at that time. Chinese got it finally, we did not get it. And now we have wanted, we are not getting it. So I think the international institutions have become somewhat hobbled. In fact, you find that whether Ukraine trouble, whether any other issue which is going on, the international institutions really, they have a hands-off policy. They are not able to achieve anything. And so this has become a new kind of not a Cold War, but I would say a war among the permanent members of the Security Council, and it's going to increase. So what happens to the other countries, which have been waiting very eagerly for the United Nations to provide peace and succor to people of the world? So this is the multilateral institution approach there that creates a problem. So I would say that to the extent that we can have Atmanirbharta, secondly, to the extent that we can have partnerships based on our common interests, I think we should be able to move ahead.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir. We can have one last question from Saurabh-ji.
Good evening, Ambassador. Sir, I'm from energy sector. Sir,
Okay.
post-pandemic and G20, we've seen interesting alliances and collaborations done by our Indian government. So in this Amrit Kaal or next 10 years, which interesting collaborations or themes do you foresee in your experience, given our foreign policy is also evolving with the changing world?
No, you are from the energy side. So I would say that, look, on energy, we are likely to become quite self-sufficient because we don't have to stop all our previous energy production, even though that may have been polluting industry, because we are such a small consumer of energy. So we have, let's say, so much ground to cover in future. So whether it's the solar energy, whether it's wind energy, whether it is the green hydrogen energy, whether it's from the waste or biofuel, which we are talking about. And then finally, we have not been able to analyze our own gas and oil resources within our country, because now lately it is coming out that our deep seas near Andaman and other areas, they are full of a lot of oil and gas resources. But then these technologies are not available everywhere. So we should be able to partner with other countries. And I think that some of these partnerships which we have developed should stand us in a good stead. And gradually we should be able to, right now we are importing 80% or 85% of our energy from abroad. But gradually we should be able to take care of it mostly by ourselves if we move into these new energy sources. The other one problem had been, of course, also that even at the international level, we needed support from the major multinationals or big developed countries. Now, big developed countries handed over all the energy, renewable energy or new energy programs to their established multinational corporations, who set up some small programs, but they were really not interested because they didn't want to lose their monopoly, whatever they called them, Seven Sisters or other things. So therefore, they moved very slowly. Now the pressure is coming up to move fast. And you see that, I mean, when the fracking started, America and Canada, which wanted to become the leaders for environment-friendly energy technologies, they are the ones who are going for the worst kind of energy production. And in fact, they are producing the maximum amount of pollution, but they're not bothered about it, about the life of their people and all that, because I think the democratic countries, definitely, but they are not the democracy that we have. Our democracy, I would say, is far more democratic than many of the countries who call themselves democracies.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir, for answering all the questions. And thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure to have you among us today.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Very kind of you and very kind all of you. Wish you all the very best.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mukulji. All the very best to you.
Yes.
I will listen
Thank
to
you.
you for 5-10 more minutes and then I will
Okay.
go away.
All right.
Thank you very
All
much.
right. That will be just fine.
Next, I would like to invite Professor Mukul, visiting distinguished professor IMPRI, former Professor Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, NUS, to discuss marketization of public enterprises. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Let me just share. Okay, is that fine?
Yes, sir. Visible. Yeah.
I have called, or I have titled my presentation as not as privatization, but marketization of public enterprises, how to bring market-like discipline in its true sense to public enterprises. And that is really, in many cases, the crux of public enterprise reform that is going on. During the 1940 to 1970 period, nationalization of business enterprises and setting up of new public enterprises was widely pursued by many countries. That was the prevailing ideology which supported it. But with experience and mounting evidence that nationalization has been increasingly viewed as a policy in search of a theory. There is no economic theory supporting nationalization. And as a policy which had some short-term political and economic benefits, but enormous medium to long-term economic and social cost. So there was, as evidence mounted, like in India, nationalization of banks and insurance companies. You know, it's quite amazing to think at this time that in up to 1997, more than billion people in India had only one life insurance company, LIC. I mean, how insurance is such a complicated business. India requires around 150 insurance companies, and we had one monopoly, which then could be politically used, had no incentive to develop, was very non-transparent. Even today, to get to balance sheet and income statement of LIC is a very, very complicated task. And there is a lot of non-transparency over there. So banks, insurance companies, we saw the airline. I was fortunate enough to fly in Air India in 1963 when I went to America. And at that time, Air India was the third or the fourth best airline in the world. And it was nationalized in 56. So on the basis of that, it lasted for a while. But by the time late 60s and so on, it deteriorated so much. And only now, after paying enormous cost and enormous loss of competitiveness in the aviation sector, that we are able to address the Air India problem. Okay, so mining, space, others, a lot of them fall in that category. Short-term political or so economic benefits, but large cost. Now there is a drastic change in thinking globally. Example is from our Prime Minister, Modi. He says now, which it would have been unthinkable, you know, Harsh talked about that Nehru said that profit is a dirty word. To J.R.D. Tata, to all people, that government has no business to do business. This is the Prime Minister talking. Its job is to think about food for the poor, make houses and toilets for them, get them clean drinking water, make health facilities available, make roads, to think about small farmers, and so on. It has no business to do business. So that is one mindset change that has occurred since the 70s. So at that time, it was in fashion, you know, and a lot of countries did a lot of that. A lot of them are trying to unwind slowly, but it's not easy to unwind once you have large public sector enterprises. As Ginting and Naqvi in 2020 note that despite the rise of what they call privatization over the past 20 years, state-owned enterprises are still prevalent in many countries, globally accounting for about 20% of investment, 5% of employment, and up to 40% of output. And despite their active participation, however, the general trend in overall state ownership is downwards. Okay, so this is part of, once you have built it up, takes a lot of time to prudently spiral in the downward direction. Robinet in 2020 has argued that the COVID-19 pandemic has increased the urgency of public enterprise reform. It has had a direct and highly damaging effect on many SOEs, including airports, tourism-linked enterprises that have seen revenues go down, as have national oil companies, commodity producers, and others who have to be then given help to make the wider economy not go down so rapidly. Broad-based and ambitious state-owned enterprise reform is needed to achieve the same or better service delivery with improved fiscal and financial performance. So before, in the public enterprise debate, there never was emphasis on quality of service delivery. So what is important for an enterprise is to give what customers want. And what customers, in this case citizens, they want accessible and affordable service. So take, for example, electricity. It is a public sector enterprise. And if you don't have an efficiency there, what do many apartments and others have to do? Set up their own generators. It's very expensive. If I'm a big farmer, I need irrigated water. I need to run my diesel pumps. Government says I give you free electricity. Would I be able to depend on that? I'll have a huge loss. I'll spend my own money to set up my generation system. So that we never thought of that before, but now this is something that has become important. This includes corporate governance reform. We never thought of, and there are anecdotal stories which I cannot vouch for, that at one stage in India, you could buy a public sector bank chairmanship for 10 crores or something. Okay, and that buying, and Parliament, it has been said that there were phone calls to give loans by public sector banks, knowing that this loan will never come back. Okay, so corporate governance was very weak. The introduction of performance management system and transparency, accountability, accounting policies, and the other public sector obligations that need to be done. That's why marketization. You know, in private sector company, every quarter you have to report to the stock exchange if you are listed on your financial performance. And that has to be audited by independent auditors. In many public sector enterprises, there is no auditing. And I think yesterday Radhika had pointed out about the off-budget liabilities of public enterprises and the problems that have been mentioned. Many state-owned enterprises will require deeper restructuring, including ones that have just been brought from failing private sector companies. The state-owned enterprises will need proven and professional management. There's no ownership. It's proven and professional management. How do you select people to place the restructured state-owned enterprises into a sustainable recovery plan? Independent board members qualified to oversee this process. And many times, you know, before, many public enterprises, people who were on the board were not qualified to run it. Okay, many managing directors were not qualified to run because selection criteria was different. Non-core functions should be shut down, spun off, and transparency and accountability will be essential for the entire restructuring process, including the sensitive disposal of impaired and other assets. Many enterprises didn't have asset registry. Now, if you don't have asset registry, if you don't know what you own, how are you going to manage the assets well? So in many times when I've consulted, these are the things that we have said the enterprise to do, is to create an asset registry. Crucially, successful reform requires going beyond state-owned enterprise level governance and restructuring. It requires a fundamental change in how the state acts and as an owner of assets. This function must be professionalized, depoliticized, and separated from policy making and regulation. So you create a holding company, specialized entity, you list them so they come under SEBI regulation in India, and not under mutually scratch my back regulation of ministry and the public enterprise. Steel ministry runs steel enterprise, and there is a conflict of interest. It also requires developing a two-sided balance sheet for public commercial assets and process that can help identify new assets like real estates that are undervalued and underutilized. IMF has estimated that better utilization of public asset in this way can add public revenue equal to 3% of GDP. That's not small at all. You know, we saw tax to GDP ratios that Radhika and Professor Govind Rao had given. So 3% is huge. Part of this reform includes the correct classification of state-owned enterprise, debt, and borrowing. Yes, again, Radhika's point yesterday. State-owned enterprise borrowing often has an implicit or explicit government guarantee, making it part of national debt and the government's overall debt burden. Sometimes governments claim that there is not a guarantee, but push the social programs and spending through state-owned enterprises. But they push spending in this way. This is just hiding the debt. However, financially viable state-owned enterprise can legitimately borrow without guarantees, reducing the overall national burden. Now, we have been using frameworks, which we have repeatedly emphasized that framework is not a blueprint. You don't follow it exactly. It is an aid to thinking. So now, if I want to reform the public enterprises, and I can't privatize in the sense of selling off, I want to do this kind of reforms and restructuring that we had talked about. Where do we start? Business environment. First, you have to liberalize to increase competition and provide freer access to the market. So recently in the new parliament session, special session, one bill introduced was on the post office. In the Post Office Act, which we were using of 1871 or something, completely outdated, only post office can deliver letters. Okay. How silly it is that only post office can deliver letters. So this bill says no, anybody can, courier company, others. We deliver other things. So why not deliver letter as well? Why not create agencies which post office can give out and they can run later, they get some rent, post office get lease income and things like that. So we are, that's market, all this is marketization, using market-like element into functioning. Deregulate, but if you deregulate, so if we had till 1997, we had one life insurance company, but now we have about 30 plus. So we need an insurance regulator. So IRDAI, Insurance Regulator Development Authority of India, was set up in 1997. Okay. before the insurance bill got passed. Non-life insurance, we have another 30, 35. Okay. And they are also regulated by IRDAI. So when you deregulate, sometimes you have to re-regulate. Same thing with airline. If you had only Air India, no need for regulator. Now we have got a very rich aviation landscape, and it's a complex landscape. We need to grow further, and we need a good regulator to do that. So we try to do that with ports, with others, and that's why the number of regulatory authorities have gone up very sharply over the last 20 years. Then you demonopolize. So one of the demonopolization example I'll give is mining. Can anybody do coal mining? Why not? Can anybody have a space venture? Why not? Why should only state have monopoly to do coal mining or space? Or what special competence does the state have in these areas? They don't. And we never asked that when ideology was nationalization. Then organization. So you corporatize. LIC is now listed. So LIC has to follow the SEBI regulations. They have to, we know a little bit. It's still not as transparent as we would like, not as much accountable, but much more so than the others. Same thing with public sector banks. They have to reveal a lot than before. So you corporatize and put them on the stock exchange. You come under Companies Act company, and you have to follow that. So corporate governance, you have to have a women independent director. You have to have other independent directors. You have to list qualification. You have to justify, give to Ministry of Corporate Affairs why you have somebody, what skill does it bring, and so on. So you increase, this is what again, the marketization means. The performance-related incentives have never worked much between SOE and government because there's a mutual conflict of interest. The government ministries and others, they use public enterprises for their own purposes. And public enterprise people want to go to the ministry. So neither is going to be harsh on each other. Okay, there will be sweetheart deals all the time. And that's why they don't work. And you fragment, break up the firm in a number of separate entities, which are manageable and not too diverse. So that is business environment, organization. Then you go to finance, user pay. So how do you do the financing by users, which is user pay, and cost recovery, where you want to subsidize, but you decide how much subsidy to give and have your pricing accordingly. So let's ask Mumbai University or University of Bangalore or Chennai, how much cost recovery they do? Maybe 3%, 5%. How can you improve your organization if your cost recovery is so low? Where's the money going to come from? The fiscal budgets are constrained, and you won't get any quality. You don't get control. If I have 3% of revenue I'm generating, government will dictate me what I should do. As Radhika pointed out about some of the states having very low own tax revenue. So user pay, then you have various types of public-private partnerships. That's a lecture, on its own. And this is a difficult area, but we need to understand risk, clarity in risk sharing, contingent liability, however, will still be on the state. Then performance. So you have contracting out, you have agency, you have franchise, you can do all of this. finally comes the ownership. Okay, so you don't do ownership first when you want to do public enterprises, and that too, you can have transfer of ownership by private offer of shares, public offer of shares, restricted sale or lease of assets. So if you go to JNU Port is a public sector entity. One part of JNU Port has been leased out to the private sector. They can do what they want in that leased. And this way, JNU Port has information about how the private sector is doing. So that creates efficiency benchmark. This is how you do reform, okay? These subtle ways. And they've just leased out. It's still owned, land is still owned by the public sector entity, but leasing and the operation done by the private sector. So many, many different ways. And you can have divestment with control. So you give up 5%, 10%, and just like LIC. LIC is still controlled by the government, okay? But they've given up bit of ownership, and then it is listed on the stock exchange. People own some of the shares, but the control is different. You can control a company today with less than 20% of around 20% of the ownership. Okay, so ownership is not the criteria for control. You can still control it, and you can do it through different types of complex ways in which ownership can be diluted, shared, and others. So notice that you need to work on a matrix, this framework, according to which organization you want to improve and which are the critical areas that you need to do. So the broader system reforms and divestment method. And so the well-defined legal and regulatory framework, institutional capacity, good governance, and the competition to be introduced. The policy environment is market-friendly. Process is managed in a professional and transparent way and avoids concentration of assets in the hands of the few. But we still have large and strategic state-owned enterprise. So we still need to keep control in certain things even as we reform them. Okay, but we need to reform because we can't continue to have the inefficiency performing. But not all public enterprises are inefficient. Some of the world's best run enterprises are public. Has anybody heard of DHL, a courier company? Yes? Anybody can say whether they have heard or not? DHL? Yes or no? Okay, thank you. So DHL, who owns it? It is owned by German Post Office. Globally competitive company, technologically advanced, owned by a government-owned post office. Whole thing. So, or take our own ISRO. ISRO is a public sector organization, globally competitive, right? Many want to work with ISRO. It is efficient and it has shown what it can do. And note that very few of the ISRO engineers are from IITs and so on. They are all from regional engineering colleges. Local talent has worked on it. So pedigree is not necessary to be globally recognized as a competitive operator. So it is where we need to improve, we improve those. And there are a lot of these methods that I mentioned. New Delhi's Ashoka Hotel, icon, to be privatized. We operate, maintain, and develop. Notice that they will operate, they will maintain it, they will develop it for a period of 60 years. So this is a contract, not giving up complete ownership. It's a contract to monetize its spare land for commercial development and luxury apartment. So anybody that has been to Ashoka Hotel, when I go to Delhi, one visit is done for Ashoka Hotel because there they have an extremely nice South Indian restaurant below, my favorite place where I go every time I'm in Delhi. So but they've got huge area, not well utilized in the heart of Delhi. So opportunity cost that Govind was talking about is not recognized till now for Ashoka Hotel, and we are now trying to do something about it. Now, you can see how the public sector banks, when motivated, reform can rise to the challenge. In 2008, we were the world's most unbanked country. And the price of data in India, now we are the most banked, okay? And you have heard of the story, the India Stack story. The price of data fell exponentially, and we have got India as one of the lowest price data anywhere in the world. And again, public sector is dominant in that space. So let's look at the banking sector. With minimal ownership change, how our banking sector has improved. Case study. Modi government in 2014 inherited a weak banking sector burdened by the NPAs and stuck economic projects. The exclusion of 50% of Indians from formal banking also faced with complex debt recovery and politically influenced bank leadership. So former RBI governor said that large number of non-performing loans were given between 2006 and 2008. But notice the turnaround. CRISIL, our credit rating agency, has predicted that banks' non-performing assets to reach a decade low of 3.8% by 23-24. And this is a reduction from 4.2, from 4.9, and so on. So we are going to have among the cleanest balance sheets in 15 years. So clearly the minimal ownership change, but the public enterprise reform of the direction I'm talking about has worked. Banks have also been profitable in recent years. The SBI, State Bank of India, achieved a record net profit in the fourth quarter of 23, and the net profit was 16,695 crore, surpassing 50,000 crore for FY23. Similarly, Punjab National Bank, Union Bank, we don't think of this bank as very efficient or profitable, but they have turned profitable. How was this remarkable change achieved under the government led by PM Modi? The following measures, along with focus on good niyat, intent, and probably one of the big messages from our course is niyat chahiye. अच्छी नियत है तो अच्छा काम होगा, बुरी नियत है कितने भी स्मार्ट हो काम नहीं हो. And implantation of सबका साथ, सबका विकास, सबका विश्वास, and सबका प्रयास message has helped. In the initial 2 years of Modi's tenure, initiatives like Jan Dhan Yojana, Insolvency and Bankruptcy Act were introduced, and they aim to expand banking access and streamline the legal processes for resolving troubled loans. And the next major reform was the merger of several public sector banks. Harsh mentioned size matters. If you are going to the digital banking and so on, technology is very expensive. For that, you need size. A small size bank with, $20,000 rupees of deposits will not cannot be technology leader. Okay, because technology costs are high, expertise needed is high. So they merged, and they merged 10 PSBs into few, and to tackle losses and improve operations. Another major step was establishment of a bad bank to address the issue of non-performing loans, NPAs known as bank loans, and the National Asset Reconstruction Company, as a bad bank. They acquire troubled loans and other liquid holdings. So now you have segregated, then you continue with your normal business. So बैंकों की हेल्थ सुधारने के लिए RBI का ICU. So उसको ICU में डाल दिया, and others. So gross NPA ratio of schedule and commercial banks. Notice this is where 2014. Notice the high, and we have been reducing it fairly well. Okay, and we need to go down. We need to go down further. This data is from RBI. Net profits of the banking sector. Notice that the banking sector was making losses. Public sector banks, they were making losses in here. Now, with reforms, without privatization, right? They have been making profits. And the commercial banks also had some problems. They are also making profits now. So the bad loans that we had talked about, you can read that. And the government enacted Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code of 2016. This allows board suspension, promoter owner removal, time-bound loan recovery for companies and individuals. And so that Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code help speed up the cleaning up of the banking system. The market share of private versus public banks is also changing. In rural areas, public sector banks have very high share, private sector low, semi-urban and urban, private sector has good share, and metropolitan. So, but you expect that more and more, as Harsh mentioned about villages changing, you will see the blue area increasing in the rural sector as well. But the top 10 districts collectively disperse more than half of India's credit. Where are they? Mumbai, Delhi, Bangalore, Chennai, Hyderabad, Kolkata, Ahmedabad, Pune, Gurgaon, Jaipur. Okay, these are the data. Okay, and this is the where do the loans go? Notice most of the loans are for homes. Okay, then there are personal loans, vehicle loans, credit card, loan against FD, education, gold to buy, and others. But a home, so the real estate sector that we are seeing in the retail loan market is very, very critical. So are the personal loans that we need to watch for. And this is where are they going? infrastructure is very big. Metal, textiles, food processing, engineering, and so on. But the infrastructure is where a lot of the bank credit is going. And again, consistent with what Radhika said yesterday. Share of the bank groups in lending. Public sector here loaned 57%. Foreign banks were a small part, and the private sector 37%, and the small finance bank had a small share. But the foreign banks share has not really been increasing very much. And we need to get more foreign banks into the country. Now that is a banking. And I know time is running out, so I'll run through very fast. This is the Indian Railways. Indian Railway Catering and Tourism Corporation. It is still public, but now what is it doing? Its income in FY23 was US 130 million. Net income, profit, net. Revenue 440 million. Founder, Ministry of Railways, founded 99, long before 2014. So this, what Harsh mentioned, there have been reforms in the, in the past 20 years, and this is one of them where this has happened. And how do they make money? They make money 27% from catering, 2% from state tirtha, 9% from water, okay, 54% from tickets, and 8% from tourism. So can you see they can't rely on tickets? Neither can railways. That's a little more than half. They've got to have others and the competence to do others well to get revenue, what we had mentioned before. ISRO, we have said that, and they will transfer its small satellite launch vehicle to the private sector. Okay, the commercialized satellite launch services. And India became signatory to the Artemis Accords for advancing space activities beyond Earth's orbit. And this is where you have to have common political understanding and so on. How do you do that? But notice we are partnering with the best in the world. NASA is the best space agency in the world. ISRO, NASA considers it worthy that ISRO partner it. That's the change, that others want to partner us. And there are a lot of other things that ISRO is doing as well. So on the other hand, reform state enterprises, 34 Karnataka government-run enterprises were worth nothing. This is by CAG. The net worth of 34 PSCs is either zero or negative. There are 34 state-run public enterprises. It's completely eroded. And Karnataka is 125 PSCs and so on. So we need to reform state enterprises, Radhika pointed out, is important. We are changing the nuclear, the 6-decade-old atomic energy law to allow involvement from non-state enterprises to come in. And Gati Shakti is again whole of India vision. And the groundbreaking Central Railway is doing zero scrap, demonstrating a relentless commitment to identify and eliminate various forms of scrap. So this is all, you don't need to change ownership. You can do a lot of things. And they earned 132 crores from that. And I'd already mentioned 3D, additive manufacturing. This post office is made from additive manufacturing to save cost. And the Indian Railway Finance Corporation, government will sell some of it owns 86%. It will still remain controlled, but it will earn some money by doing that. And the ports, we need more and more ports, and our state ports should be going abroad in order to make that, to increase our volume. So Gati Shakti, we talked about. Kochi Water Metro in Kerala state, it's a state-owned, will connect around 10 islands in and around Kochi using battery-operated electric boats. And the real-time digital payment we have talked about. Here is the last one, Mining Act tweaked, plan to have rare critical mineral exploration by private sector, which is not allowed. Okay, this is developing railway stations. Now let me give you Ahmedabad example. This is the planned Ahmedabad railway station. Have you ever thought that in India we will see a railway station which is multimodal, which is where railway will be incidental, lot of other commercial activities? What will happen to property tax of Ahmedabad? It will go up quite sharply because all these property development is going to occur. Others, that's transformation. Okay, and you can do it. It's still public. Okay, so we don't need to have that sharp things between public and private before. Okay, I think I've taken a bit too long, but I've given you my central message that public enterprise reform, you can use a framework. Ownership is not what economic theory teaches us. There is no separate theory of public sector firm, private sector firm. 4 things are needed. 1, you have to have the competition. You can't have monopoly. Monopoly is the biggest one for inefficiency. And second is organizational incentives. You have to clean up. Karnataka, there is no network. You got to clean up. And individual incentives. How do you recruit? How do you get, all the organizational corporate governance? Finally, technology. And we have advantage in technology. So if you do these 4, ownership is not going to be that important. Sorry, Gupta, I've taken bit longer than I had planned.
No worries
My
at all.
apologies.
No problem. Sir. Thank you so much for that informative session. If there are any questions, we can take a few. I request participants to raise their hands or put their question in the Q&A box. Suvendruji, go ahead.
Yeah, I had a very generic question that what is the email mechanism for us to correspond if we have to share some feedback, please?
Sure, you can mail
sorry.
it to, no, sorry, regarding feedback. So you can mail it to learning@IMPRI in case you have any feedback.
Sure, thank you very much.
Any questions from the participants?
This is Suvendu. If I may ask one specific question to Professor Asher. Professor Asher, this capital investment that is being made in such a large scale to uplift Indian railways, right? There is
Yes.
also a lot of criticism that is coming of late that how this is going to be funded, okay, given that there is a lot of shift to air travel and not many people will be possibly, I think, there is a shift to air travel. So how do you justify the source of investment that is needed to do such a modern, large scale upliftment for Indian railways and its infrastructure, especially the new stations that's being made, like the 35 new stations coming up, which is good. But I think, that's a very question that is in everybody's mind. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you're raising an important question that we need the infrastructure investment to be spent efficiently and effectively with the financial uh, uh, aspects recovery that should also be considered. Now, railways, as we saw, they are trying to rely less and less on the budget, and the budget has increased quite sharply. So their expansion plans are coming out of the capital allocation to the railways, because overall, as Radhika pointed out, the allocation for infrastructure and capital expenditure has gone up very sharply in the budget, keeping revenue expenditure in reasonable check. Then I gave an example of the railways getting things from scrap, 130 crores, which we never thought. And railways are identifying assets and they are monetizing their assets. And that asset monetization will be another important part. But each project is going to be different. So the Ahmedabad project, I gave you I skipped the details there in the slides as to how they are going to structure it. And if we use Ashoka Hotel example, they've got a lot of land. The land will be given for commercial purposes from which the revenue can be raised and used it to upscale the sector. So same thing will happen in the railways. Railways are among the largest owner of land. So when they are the largest owner of land, they need to use their airspace rights, their rights below, their rights around the land. They have to use it in a more do it monetization part. And I think you have to go not by the aggregate railways, but by project. And that is very hard because many of these are not published. So you are right to raise the concern. And I think we should keep on raising the concern and ask for transparency in when the projects are done. But I'm not worried that because air travel is increasing, rail travel will suffer. Okay. We are because the overall economy size is growing, right? I showed you a slide where it says what will be India's GDP in 2047, 22 trillion. And here it is 3.5, 4, approaching 4 trillion. So economic activity will go, connectivity will go up, everything will go up. I don't think we need to worry on the demand side.
Sure. Thank you very much.
So we can have one last question from Ashish ji. Ashish ji, go ahead.
Yeah. Good evening. Are you able to hear me, sir?
Yes.
Professor Ashar, I just wanted to know whether, this restructuring of public enterprise or this whole idea of marketization is geared towards the operating ratio or the capital debt ratio of these enterprises, or do the restructuring mandates run more deeper than just managing the fiscal, should I be saying, problems of these public enterprises?
No, I mean, let's take our electricity discoms. They are in state. If they give poor service and they are not in good fiscal health, the whole economy suffers. You have higher price electricity, you have a less reliable electricity, then on the top of that, you allow some freebies on the electricity to some people, and that raises the cost, which raises the cost of doing business, which goes all the way downstream. So this will have wide-ranging effect, and you can't, public enterprises, the whole idea that public enterprises means inefficiency, cost overruns, and so on, that needs to go. They need to be run professionally. And if they provide good, accessible, affordable service, that benefits the whole economy. So it has the fiscal part in terms of the reforms that I had mentioned. They improve the fiscal part, but they improve the ease of living of the people as well, and the quality of life of the people as well, if they improve. Okay, and so we are trying to improve one by one. It will take some time, but basically introducing competition, organizational reform, and incentive structure reform, individual incentive structure reform, adapting technology to them so scale can be applied. That has to be good for the economy and for the people as a whole. In the process, it improves the fiscal system.
Right. Thank you, sir. We'll take one short question, if possible, from Amrita ji. Amrita ji.
Thank you for that insightful session. My question was, what is your view of bureaucrats heading public enterprises?
Sorry, I didn't hear you. Your
My
voice got cut.
question was, what is your view of bureaucrats heading public enterprises?
I think, we shouldn't use the word, I like to use the word government officials. Okay, not bureaucrats. The private sector, if you go to Tata's and Birla companies, they've got as much bureaucracy as any. But we don't call Tata official as bureaucrat. We call them a Tata official. And I think we should change our mindset, use the word government officials. Now, the government official, as was pointed out, we need generalists, we need specialists, and we need to blend them together, but they have to have some competence too. And competence, whoever it is, specialist or generalist, they have to have competence. Now, let's take example of our current RBI governor. Current RBI governor has done a wonderful job. Who is he? He is a career civil servant, government official. So people who came before with high pedigree didn't do a good job. He did. So you have to select the person. And one of the reasons why we were not able to do that differentiation is that we never assessed people at the secretary, joint secretary, other level. Now we are instituting a system to assess, to shift through, and to try to appoint the people who are right. And there are a lot of skills that are needed, not just degrees or others, a lot of other people skills that need to go into the selection process. For banking sector, we now have a selection process that was led by former CAG. And in different areas now, we are trying to see that the right set of people go. Second is we are doing the civil service reform, where before we just recruited people and gave them a job. Okay. Now what we are doing is we are saying, what role do we want person to play? Select the person to play the role. So that change in civil service recruitment will slowly percolate. It's at the beginning stages. And given, as we have seen, the right kinds of motivation, the others, the one that should itch in our minds forever is what Prime Minister Modi did when the Chandrayaan mission failed, right? First time. What did he do? He went to the ISRO He cried with the ISRO head and with the staff. He said, I am with you. Go ahead, do it. And as I said, there are no pedigrees there. These are all, these are also what you call bureaucrats as head. These are government officials, and we can get a lot of work done. Who did Jandan? The same public sector of banking officials whom generally we think of as very inefficient, rude, others, and so on. They did the Jandan, made India from most unbanked to most banked. So it is not bureaucrat or government official versus other. We need to think of how a good organization functions, what does it need, try to provide that, provide leadership, provide confidence, and we get good outcome. Even then, some will not be able to do the job well, and we should have mechanism to change.
Thank you.
It's a long-winded answer, but
thank you, sir, for answering all of those questions. With that, I think we can conclude today's session.
yes, please.
So as we come to the end of day 7 of the 1-month immersive online intermediate certificate training course on contours of public policy in India in the Amrit Kaal, I, Gupta, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, would like to propose the formal vote of thanks on behalf of IMPRI, Center for the Study of Finance and Economics, CSFE, New Delhi. We are grateful to our experts for day 6 of this course, Professor Mukul, Ambassador Shashank, and Mr. Harsh Gupta Madhusudhan. With that, I would like to, for taking out their valuable time and giving an opportunity to the participants to learn from this online certificate training program. We thank all of our participants who have raised pertinent questions and actively participated in today's deliberation. We look forward to welcoming you next week, that is the 29th of September at 6 p.m. for the 8th day of this certification course by distinguished experts Professor Anil K. Gupta and Mr. Yash Agarwal. We are grateful if you are watching us later on YouTube or listening to us on our various podcasts or listening to our or reading our publications. We hope you continue to join in future to IMPRI Web Policy Talk and Web Policy Learning. Wishing you all a very good evening. Thank you. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Bye
you.
to everyone.
Thank you. Very nice session. Thank you.